Interview of the morning now. The country's news industry has taken a knock since the implementation of the national lockdown in March. Research by the South African National Editors Forum, that's SANEF, says even though audiences have surged on certain platforms, there have also been massive job losses and pay cuts, the closure of some print publications, and there are looming threats of widespread retrenchments. The COVID-19 impact on journalism report was released yesterday, and to tell us more about this, we're joined by Kate Skinner. She's the Executive Director at SANEF. Great to see you, Kate. Thanks so much for being with us here on the programme.
Good morning.
Much of the media has really been working around the clock to provide information to citizens, but also at the same time taking health risks in the process. How are journalists coping with this pandemic?
So I think that they're having a very difficult time. The issue is that they are on the front line, as you're saying. We have had a journalist that has died. We have a number of journalists that have contracted the disease, and also I think one of the big issues is that a number of journalists have also had major salary cuts. And so their work has not in any way decreased, but they are out there. Some journalists have lost up to 40% of their salaries. I think the other thing to say as well is that particularly marginalized and smaller publications have been particularly badly hit. And so a number of those journalists have actually lost their jobs altogether. So if we look at some of the little publications, small little print publications across the country, organized by the Association of Independent Publishers, 80 of those have in fact closed. And of course, a huge number of jobs have been lost. 300 to 400 jobs we estimate have been lost through that. So yes, I think the media is having a very difficult time, and yet, of course, absolutely essential to tell us what is going on in the country.
Yeah, and that's the reality. I mean, I don't think for a very long time the demand for information from the media has been more needed at a time like this. And yet, we talk to this devastating report that was brought out, and I must say I was reading it and feeling very sad during this process of reading it. I mean, first we saw magazines closing down, and this, I know it's been long, unfortunately, in the running, that magazines are losing revenue and not many people are physically buying them anymore. They'll get them online or wherever it may be. But magazines going, smaller publications, as you mentioned, going, news organizations, journalists, these online platforms that everyone expects to read for free, and yet there are people working there that are not earning an income. How sustainable is this?
So I think that's what we're very worried about. So I think that's what we're very worried about. And that's actually the reason why we launched this report, was to say, well, what can we do about this? Let's look at the sustainability of the media going forward, and then let's look at what is actually needed. So the second phase of this research is to look at the possibility of setting up an emergency fund, and then we've got to also look at what that emergency fund might do, because as we've been talking, I mean, of course, the emergency is at so many different levels. So it's at the level of particular journalists that have lost their jobs. It's at the level of journalists who are receiving much lower salaries. It's at the level of entire publications that have closed, and also, of course, we haven't even got to some of the tiny radio stations around the country, some not so tiny, some quite big. And so what we've got to look in terms of the emergency fund is at what level do we look at supporting the industry, and can we actually support the industry at multiple levels? And so we will be talking to government. We will also be talking to corporates to say, we need to look at multiple interventions here if we wanting to maintain the strength of our media industry.
Yeah. It's many also look towards sort of Twitter as their sense of news, and what's been quite fascinating, and I heard that during their interaction with the president on Sunday, and we'll talk a little bit to that in a short while. But I think one of the panelists, or one of the journalists, I don't know if it was Adrian Besson, talking to the fact that people are not necessarily looking to Twitter for news. They're now turning to reputable news sources where you'll get onto websites, you'll read the articles, you'll want the journalist's voice. I mean, increases of numbers like 72% up on websites is what I'm reading here. The news, just here at the SABC, a 60% increase in the viewership of news, particularly in the one language, isiXhosa, because people are desperate for information. So this must show you that the demand is there, however, the revenue is dropping. So the idea of trying to meet a balance, it almost is a tough one, and it needs some form of intervention.
I completely agree with you. Because I think the issue there is that you're right. I mean, absolutely unbelievable audience surges. Although I think the one thing that we need to be kind of mindful of the fact is that some of the publications that are more working class audiences didn't have huge surges, and I found that really interesting. And I think that was data related, because poorer audiences then couldn't actually access websites. So it was more middle class audiences online, we think, but we have to look at that further. But certainly from the side of the SABC and the broadcasters, phenomenal increases. So you're right. We need to look at the fact that news has never been so important. News from credible sources has never been so important, and I think that is really powerful. But the thing is that this is a crisis moment, given the fact that the economy is really not in a good state, and of course, media is very dependent on advertising, and so that is why we are looking at short-term interventions, emergency interventions that might keep various media entities going until, in fact, the economy starts to improve and the advertising revenue starts to improve. But of course, then there's also the issue of the fact that we do need to start to look at new business models for the media, because advertising kind of going forward isn't always that stable. And there isn't, a huge amount of advertising. And online, Facebook and Google gets huge amounts of advertising. So there are all kinds of complicated issues that we have to look at.
It's a complicated industry, but it's a devastating situation, because, I mean, you talk to advertising and advertising revenue, and even when you looked during the course of the lockdown, alcohol advertising was non-existent, and no doubt that's one of the big money spinners for most websites and publications. And during the lockdown, besides essential items, nothing was allowed to be advertised. So that advertising spend came down to zero. But the reality is that many people are going to get job losses. I mean, you spoke to those numbers within this industry. What does a world look like without journalists, without publications that are telling you truth, and a government that is dependent upon the media to spread the word and to spread the message? It is a dangerous situation at the end of the day if there's not funding coming our way.
Well, I think you raise an extremely important point, because, I mean, of course, we are very, very concerned about our own journalists, and we're very concerned about publications, etc. But the media is much bigger than that. The media plays this absolutely essential role in society in terms of telling people about what's going on in society, but also, of course, holding those in power accountable. So, during this COVID period, I mean, we need to be holding government to account. We need to be holding various institutions to account. We need to be holding the police, the security authorities to account. And that is why you need the media, and you need a strong media. And also, I think the other thing that's really important to stress is that you need media in little towns. You need media across the country, because, those little towns are often under the radar, and it allows for various abuses of power. And so I'm really glad you said that, because we do need to look at what the role of media is in society, and of course, particularly during a pandemic.
And that's the real story here, is the fact that the stories of South Africans need to be told, and if they are not told, it turns into an awful situation of a country that can just do what it likes without these things being highlighted. And I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic right now. It's a situation that many South Africans, I mean, including you and I, have never been in. We've never understood this before, and so the questions need to be asked and they need to be answered. And this brings me to that conversation that was held with the president on Sunday. I mean, I watched the entire thing and listened with bated breath. I think the president spoke too much and the media didn't have enough room to speak, I must say. I wish I could have got more questions in from the media, who are desperate to have a Q&A with the president, because there's been this sentiment that the president has been speaking and then walking away from the microphone and not being held to account. to any of the things that are going on. Talk to us about that discussion yesterday, and were the media satisfied with being given that time with the president?
So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that we were disappointed about the fact that we had so little time to ask questions, because we had the sense of we've got 2 hours. We will be able to ask all the questions that we want to ask. And also, of course, we had so many media there. And so you had the little media, you had the big established media, you had everybody. And of course, they've got different questions to ask. And so the president did spend a lot of time giving us a feedback, which was great. But you're quite right. This was time actually more for journalists to rigorously ask a whole lot of questions. And as I say, for all the different media from their different perspectives to ask those questions. So what we're hoping to do in the future is to have a lot more interactions with the president. That's something which we think is really, really important. But of course, it must be a question and answer session. And I think the other thing to say is that we do also think that it's important to have probably those questions in advance, so that we can also make sure that, a range of different questions are asked. And, because there wasn't a lot of time, it was quite difficult to ask, all the most difficult, most important questions. So I think there's just more to do, but, more time and to be very thoughtful about the questions that we do ask.
Yeah. And it is important because we as South Africa we're very diverse, and there are many different angles and aspects that need to be addressed. And I want to come back to the very beginning of the lockdown, and there was quite an aggressive tone during one of those very first press conferences that was held by the National Command Council. And I remember that specifically. There were questions being asked about jogging and running and the lockdown and what it means. And then there started almost being this aggression towards the media, and the media getting aggressive because, they may have been asking questions that panel thought were absolutely irrelevant. And then it turned into a bit of a mud fight. And have things improved since then? Because we understand that was the beginning and everybody was tense at that point in time. But through the days and through the weeks and months, and we're now heading into 70 days of this lockdown, have we found the communication and the relationship between the media and the different ministers and councils being a bit better?
Yes. So I think, it's an interesting balance, of course, because, we had hoped with this last interaction to ask more questions and to ask harder questions. But you're totally right. What you don't want is an aggressive relationship where no one gets any information and everyone is kind of, defensive. That's absolutely not what you want. And I have to say that our relationship with the GCIS and with government has been exceptionally good under this, during this lockdown period. And so you're right, we probably was very tense at the beginning, but generally, we have actually had a good relationship with government in terms of ensuring that there's been a lot of information flowing. But not of course, there've been issues around the statistics. We've been asking very hard questions around the fact that we need much more granular statistics. We need to know what's happening in different towns, right down, every single province. We want it more regularly, what's happening with testing, consistently numbers coming out. And also, of course, we've asked government continuously for there to be specific experts on the economy and on health to be there to give us the context, the background. Why are we adopting particular strategies? And so, of course, at certain times we have had that information and we've been very satisfied, and other times we haven't. But I feel that overall that kind of fairly robust interaction between us has been healthy. Yeah. And generally we have, the information that we wanted, we have got, maybe not immediately, but eventually.
So what I need to ask you is some criticism that has come in, and I obviously we do read the criticism, and there's a lot of it out there, as you know, Kate. That's just the way a healthy democracy works, where people are able to speak. And some South Africans feel that, the reality is that journalists follow the politicians and they don't look for the story. And I read an entire thread of people talking to the fact that they've had to turn to international news organizations to get more of a story as to coronavirus, what it is about, what it entails, the different aspects of coronavirus, as opposed to the politics that's at play here in South Africa. And that is something that people are very concerned of. Have you noticed that in the reporting of our media here in South Africa?
Yes, I mean, I think it is true that you know, there are a lot of stories on. I think that's true for the coronavirus and is true now. And I think the fact that you have had so many retrenchments and you have such small newsrooms, and some of the difficulties of obviously covering stories during lockdown has meant that stories on the ground of people, what is happening, particularly in rural areas, informal settlements, etc. We haven't always got those stories, and I think it's something that the media has to be very vigilant on. And it's to the point that you were making. We are an incredibly diverse country. We are one of the most unequal countries in the world. We have to get out there and tell the stories across the country. So I think that is an important point to make, and I do think it talks to some of the issues around the financial stability of the media or lack thereof. Because if you don't have a lot of journalists out there, it does become more difficult to tell those stories. Yeah. So that's why it's so important that we look at some of these financial sustainability issues.
And I think that it's a vital aspect that South Africa needs to know. One final question, just as we go into the news bulletin, we heard about different breakdowns of the data and the request for different aspects that we may not be receiving. The one question I never asked or never heard being asked was the racial breakdown. And there's been a lot of people saying, why do we not have that racial breakdown for numbers? Maybe you're not the right person to be speaking to, you probably aren't, but this is it's a story to tell, because when you go into certain communities, some people are still believing that this is a white man's virus, and that may be a bigger problem than we realize.
That is such an interesting question. I just can't tell you the answer to it. And it's interesting because we've asked for, granular stats, not necessarily on issues of race. And I think you're right. We do need to engage that one, because it is important to get a sense of, is it rich? Is it poor people getting this? Ages, race, all of those issues, gender.
Yeah. So those are the breakdowns we definitely need. Kate Skinner, thanks for talking to us from the media perspective on reporting of COVID-19. Of course, Kate is the Executive Director of the South African National Editors Forum, talking to us about that impact that COVID-19 has had on the news industry following their report, which was released yesterday, and the meeting with the President on Sunday. All right, just gone 7.